I can't believe this man is cheating on me.
She thought her husband was falling in love with a stranger. What she found instead was a 40-year-old secret buried under a peach orchard, one her own daughters had been protecting for months. Picture this: 11 o'clock at night, a woman standing in the dark doorway of her husband's workshop, watching him through a cracked window. He's on the phone, and his voice is breaking. "I can't lose her again," he says. She doesn't know who her is. She doesn't know if her marriage just ended or if something far stranger is unfolding in front of her. 26 years of marriage. 2 daughters who tell her everything, or so she thought. It took one name on a phone screen to show her how much of her own family she never really knew. By the end of this story, a DNA test, a hidden illness, and a decades-old family secret will pull apart everything she thought was true and put it back together in a way she never saw coming. This is the story of what she found when she finally stopped looking away. 26 years of marriage teaches you to read a house without looking at it. You learn the sound of a door closed too gently. You learn which silences are peaceful and which ones are hiding something. I thought I knew every silence in my home. I was wrong about almost all of them. I met Marcus Carter when I was 26 years old, working the register at a farm supply store outside Macon while I finished my nursing degree at night. He came in every Saturday for wood glue and hardware he probably didn't need, just to have a reason to talk to me. It took him 4 months to ask me to dinner, and 28 years later, he still tells that story like it's the proudest thing he's ever pulled off. We built a life on that orchard together, his family's land, 3 generations deep, going back to a grandfather who bought it outright the year after the county finally let black families hold clear title to land like that. I never imagined, all these years later, that the quietest man I knew was capable of keeping something this big from me. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary evening that never announces itself as the last easy one you'll have for months. Marcus's phone lit up on the kitchen counter while he was out at the workshop. I wasn't trying to look. I never had been the kind of wife who checked. But the screen was already open, already glowing, already showing me 4 words I couldn't unsee. I found the address. "Please call me back, Marcus. It's time." I set the phone down like it was hot. I told myself it was nothing. A supplier, a scheduling mix-up, some ordinary business he'd explain without me even having to ask. But I didn't ask. Instead, I watched. And once you start watching your own husband, you can't stop. Over the next week, I noticed things I'd trained myself not to notice in 26 years of trusting him completely. A new caution in the way he angled his phone away from me at dinner. Tuesday errands that used to take 40 minutes stretching into 2-3 hours, with vague answers when I asked where he'd been. He started taking calls out on the porch instead of the kitchen, keeping his voice low even when he thought I wasn't near enough to hear. And a name, appearing twice more on that same screen. Ellen. I am not a woman who panics easily. I run a 12-room inn on our family's peach orchard outside Macon, Georgia, land that's been in Marcus's family for 3 generations. I've handled burst pipes during a wedding weekend and a health inspector who showed up unannounced during harvest. But there is a particular kind of fear that comes from watching someone you've shared a bed with for 26 years become, day by day, a stranger. That fear doesn't announce itself loudly. It just sits in your chest and waits, and it changes the way you move through your own house, like you're a guest in it. I started paying closer attention to everything. The mail he brought in himself instead of leaving for me. A receipt from a gas station 2 counties over that had no reason showing up in his coat pocket. A missed call log with a number I didn't recognize, called back within seconds of ringing. None of it proved anything on its own. All of it together kept me up until 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling fan, running through every version of the conversation I was terrified to have. I decided to test the one thing I thought I could still trust completely, my daughters. I called Jasmine first, the elder, a labor and delivery nurse 2 hours away in Atlanta, careful and composed in a way that used to comfort me and now, for the first time, made me suspicious. I asked, as casually as I could manage, if she knew anything about her father's Tuesday errands. There was a pause. Half a second, maybe less. Then, "No, Mom. Nothing I know of." I told myself I was imagining things. I wasn't. I called Simone next, my younger daughter, who works the tasting room down at the orchard and has never once in her life been able to lie to me convincingly. She hesitated too, longer than Jasmine had. "I don't think so," she said, in a voice that climbed half an octave on the word think. I could hear her shifting the phone to her other ear, a habit she's had since she was 12 and nervous about something. 2 daughters. 2 identical half-second silences. I had spent my whole life believing my girls told me everything. That night, I understood how much I didn't actually know. I decided I needed to see for myself. The next Tuesday, I told Marcus I had in business in town, and instead I followed his truck 20 minutes out past the county line to a small cottage I'd never seen before, tucked back off a gravel road near the river. I parked where he wouldn't notice, watching the porch light flicker against the dusk, the whole scene almost peaceful if I hadn't known better. My hands were sweating against the steering wheel. I sat there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, working up the nerve to get close enough to actually see inside. Through a gap in the curtains, I watched my husband of 26 years wrap his arms around a woman roughly my own age, both of them crying, neither of them looking like people caught in anything romantic, just people caught in something enormous. I stood frozen at the edge of that porch light, my whole body going cold despite the warm evening air, trying to make sense of a scene that refused to fit into any story I'd already told myself. I photographed it anyway. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the phone steady, but I got the picture. Marcus, this woman, an embrace that looked less like passion and more like grief. I sat in the car for almost 20 minutes afterward, engine off, trying to decide what kind of woman I was about to become. Part of me wanted to march up to that door and demand answers right then. Another part of me, the part that had spent 26 years being careful, told me to wait until I actually knew what I was looking at. I didn't confront him. I didn't trust my own voice yet. I drove straight to my brother Darnell's place instead, a retired sheriff's deputy who has spent 30 years learning how to stay calm when everyone around him is falling apart, and I asked if I could stay the night. He didn't ask questions. He just made up the guest room and waited for me to be ready to talk, setting a glass of water by the bed the way he used to when we were kids, and one of us couldn't sleep. I told him everything the next morning. Over coffee neither of us drank. The messages, the Tuesday errands, the name Ellen, appearing like a splinter under the skin of my marriage. Darnell listened the way he used to listen to witnesses, patient, unreadable, filing every detail away, occasionally jotting something on the notepad he still keeps by habit, decades after he stopped needing one for work. Then he asked the question I hadn't let myself ask yet. Do you want me to find out who she is? Or do you want to keep guessing? I said find out. For 2 days, I stayed in Darnell's guest room and went through the motions of running the inn by phone, telling Marcus I needed space, telling my daughters nothing at all. I watched the pines out Darnell's back window and rehearsed conversations I hoped I'd never have to finish. I thought about the wedding day, 26 years ago, the small church outside town, my mother's hat, Marcus's hands shaking worse than mine when he said his vows. I thought about how sure I'd been, that day, that I understood exactly who I was marrying. On the second evening, Darnell sat across from me at his kitchen table with a folder he clearly didn't want to hand over. Ellen Bishop, 41 years old, born at the same rural hospital as Marcus, placed for adoption 3 days after birth. A DNA test, taken quietly, matched her to my husband as a half-sibling. My husband, who had grown up believing his entire life that he was an only child, had spent the last 4 months secretly meeting a sister he never knew existed. I sat with that for a long time before I felt anything at all. Relief came first, sharp and disorienting, the kind of relief that makes you almost laugh out loud in a kitchen that isn't yours. He wasn't in love with a stranger, but relief gave way quickly to something colder. If this was innocent, if this was family, why had he hidden it from me? Why had my daughters lied to protect a secret that wasn't shameful at all? Unless it wasn't the secret itself they were protecting. Unless there was more, and some instinct in me already knew it. I drove home that afternoon and found Marcus in his workshop, sanding a chair he'd been restoring for weeks, the same unfinished chair he'd been avoiding finishing since all of this started. For a moment, he looked so much like the man I married that I almost turned around and left without saying anything. Instead, I put the folder on his workbench without a word. He looked at it, then at me, and something in his shoulders gave way entirely, like a beam finally allowed to bear weight it had been holding alone. He told me the whole story, haltingly, in pieces that didn't come out in order. A DNA testing kit Simone had given him as a joke gift the Christmas before last, something they'd laughed about at the time, curious where his family line might trace back to. A match he hadn't told anyone about at first, not even himself, not really, until Ellen reached out through the testing service's messaging system, tentative and apologetic, asking if he'd be willing to talk. A woman his own age, raised 3 counties over, who had spent her whole life wondering about the family that gave her up. He said he hadn't told me because he didn't understand it himself yet. A sister, out of nowhere, after 56 years of believing he was the only child of 2 parents who were both long gone and couldn't explain a thing. He described the first phone call with Ellen, how neither of them had known what to say, how they'd sat on the line for almost a full minute before either one spoke. He told me about the second meeting at a diner off the highway, how she brought an old photograph of the hospital nursery, hoping it might mean something to him, and how it hadn't. Not at first, until she mentioned a birthmark behind her left ear that matched one Marcus had carried his whole life without ever thinking twice about it. But there was more, and I could feel it coming the way you feel weather change before the sky admits it. Ellen wasn't just a reunion. She was sick, a rare blood disorder, the kind that needs a genetic match to survive, and Marcus, newly discovered as her half-brother, had quietly begun the screening process to become her donor. He'd hidden the illness from me specifically, he admitted, because he was ashamed. Ashamed that he'd never told me about a story his own mother had mentioned once, deathbed vague, about a baby given up before Marcus was born, a comment he'd dismissed for years as confusion near the end. Ashamed that a stranger's illness had cracked open a part of his identity he'd spent decades pretending not to wonder about. I understood, in that moment, that my daughters hadn't lied to protect an affair. Simone had helped set up the very DNA test that started all of this, encouraging her father gently for months to reach out to Ellen once the match came back, sitting with him more than once while he drafted and deleted the first message he ever sent her. And Jasmine, careful, guarded Jasmine, had used her hospital connections behind the scenes to help Ellen navigate the frightening early stages of her diagnosis, coordinating specialists, translating medical jargon for a woman terrified and alone in a system she didn't know how to move through. My daughters hadn't betrayed me. They'd been carrying something heavier than I understood, and they hadn't known how to hand it to me without breaking something in the process. I confronted Jasmine first, because her silence had cut the deepest. I drove to Atlanta the next day and sat with her in the small kitchen of her apartment, the two of us circling the real conversation for almost an hour before either of us was ready to have it. We talked about work, about traffic on the interstate, about anything except the thing that had brought me there, until finally I asked her, as gently as I could manage, why she hadn't trusted me enough to tell me the truth. What she told me instead had nothing to do with Marcus or Ellen at all. 2 years earlier, in the middle of a pregnancy she'd never told me about, Jasmine had lost the baby at 19 weeks. She'd gone through it almost entirely alone, convinced that telling me, the mother who'd always made loss look survivable, would somehow make her own grief feel smaller by comparison. She told me that when Ellen's diagnosis surfaced, all the language of genetics and inheritance and blood had reopened something in her she'd never let close. Every conversation about matches and markers and family history had sent her back to a hospital room she'd never described to anyone, not even her father. Keeping me out of the loop about her father's secret wasn't loyalty to Marcus. It was self-protection, a way of keeping her own unhealed grief from being dragged back into the light before she was ready. I held my daughter in that small kitchen for a long time, understanding for the first time how much of her had been quietly surviving something I never even knew to look for, and grieving, quietly, all the months I hadn't been there for it. I asked her why she hadn't come to me, even after the loss, even months later when the worst of it had passed. She said it was because I'd always been the one who made hard things look manageable, the burst pipes, the bad harvests, even losing her grandmother 2 years before that. She said she didn't want to be the thing that finally cracked that image, the daughter who needed more than I seemed to need myself. I told her that image had never been real, that I'd just gotten good at hiding my own cracks in front of my children, the same way she'd learned to hide hers in front of me. I went home changed by that conversation, but the hardest part was still ahead of us. Marcus's donor procedure was scheduled in 5 days, a medical risk neither of us had time to fully absorb before it arrived. I had to decide, quickly, whether my hurt over being the last to know outweighed my responsibility to stand beside my husband through something that could genuinely endanger his health. Simone, guilt-ridden and desperate to fix what she felt she'd broken by keeping the secret, tried to mend the growing distance between her parents, shuttling between us with a nervous energy that reminded me she was still, in many ways, the baby of the family. One evening, she showed up at the inn with a container of Marcus's favorite peach cobbler from the church ladies down the road, set it on the counter without a word, and started crying before either of us could say anything, apologizing for a secret that had never needed an apology at all. I told her, finally, what I should have said days earlier, that she hadn't done anything wrong by helping her father find his sister. That the only mistake in this whole tangled mess was how long it had taken all of us to trust each other enough to say things out loud. Simone held on to that the way she holds on to everything, completely, and for the first time since this began, I watched some of the guilt visibly lift off her shoulders. She told me she'd been terrified I'd see the DNA test as a betrayal of Marcus's parents, or worse, as her taking sides in something she didn't even understand yet herself. I told her there were no sides here. Just people who loved each other badly for a little while, trying to figure out how to do it better. 3 nights before the procedure, Ellen came to the orchard for the first time. I watched her walk the rows of peach trees Marcus's grandfather had planted, land that had been in this family since just a generation removed from sharecropping, her hand trailing along the bark the way you'd touch something you weren't sure you were allowed to touch. I understood, watching her, how much of a life she'd spent without any family markers at all. No trees planted for her birth, no rituals, no proof she belonged anywhere. She asked, almost shyly, if she could help with the harvest that fall, and I found myself, unexpectedly, wanting to give her every bit of what she'd missed. We sat on the porch that evening long after the sun went down, Marcus inside finishing paperwork for the hospital, and Ellen told me pieces of a childhood spent moving between relatives who never quite claimed her, a life built entirely on the outside of families like mine. She'd grown up in 3 different households by the time she was 10, none of them cruel exactly, all of them careful to remind her, in small ways, that she wasn't quite theirs. She wasn't angry about any of it, which somehow made it harder to hear. She just wanted, she said, to know where she came from before she ran out of time to find out. I told her she didn't have to earn her place at that table. She'd already found it. On the morning of the procedure itself, in a hospital corridor thick with the particular silence of people waiting for news, Ellen told us something that reframed everything one more time. Years earlier, before she ever took a DNA test or thought to look for Marcus, she had tracked down whatever records existed of their birth mother. Old church registries, a county clerk's office 2 hours from where she grew up, a distant cousin willing to talk, and learned the adoption hadn't been voluntary at all. Their mother had been pressured to give Marcus up by her own family, decades ago, over a small-town scandal no one had ever spoken of since. Marcus's whole life, it turned out, had been shaped by a decision he'd never known was forced on someone who never stopped wanting him. Marcus didn't say much when Ellen told him. He just sat very still in that hard plastic hospital chair, staring at nothing, absorbing 56 years of assumptions rearranging themselves all at once. I took his hand and didn't try to fill the silence. Some things don't need narration. They just need someone sitting beside you while you feel them. Jasmine and Simone stood on either side of us, and for a moment none of us said anything at all, the 4 of us just breathing in the same recycled hospital air, waiting for the nurse to call Marcus's name. The procedure succeeded. I sat in the recovery room with Marcus on one side and Ellen on the other, my daughters standing at the foot of the bed, and for the first time, since that phone lit up on the kitchen counter weeks earlier, there was nothing left in that room that any of us were hiding from each other. It felt less like an ending and more like the family finally exhaling all at once, after weeks of holding a breath none of us had admitted to holding. Ellen recovered fully over the following months, and by the time autumn came around, she was a fixture at the orchard's harvest, learning to work rows she hadn't grown up on and pick fruit from branches that had nothing to do with her childhood and everything to do with the one she was building now. She was clumsy with the picking baskets at first, and Simone teased her about it mercilessly, the way she'd teased Jasmine for years, the way sisters do when they've decided someone belongs to them. By October, Ellen had her own chair at our Sunday dinner table, no longer a guest, no longer waiting to be told she could stay. Jasmine, finally able to grieve her loss openly instead of carrying it in silence. Let me back into a part of her life I hadn't even known was closed off. We planted a small tree of her own that October, not for a harvest, not for fruit, just for the baby she'd never had a place to remember. She cried harder that afternoon than I'd seen her cry in years, and for once, I let her, instead of rushing to fix it the way I always used to. Simone stopped apologizing for a secret that had turned out to be an act of love rather than betrayal, and started, slowly, trusting herself again, the nervous energy in her settling into something steadier than I'd seen in years. Marcus planted a new row of peach trees that November, in the soft red Georgia clay near the river, for a sister he had almost never met and now couldn't imagine his life without. I stood at the edge of the orchard watching him work, thinking about how close I had come to losing something over a misunderstanding, and how much closer I had come to gaining something I never expected to need. By the following spring, the inn was fuller than it had been in years. Darnell coming by most Sundays now, Ellen learning to make my grandmother's biscuits under Simone's patient, laughing instruction, Jasmine driving down from Atlanta more often than she ever had before. I watched my family gather around that same kitchen table where this whole story started, and I thought about how differently things could have gone if I'd let that first night of suspicion harden into something permanent, instead of staying curious enough to find out what was actually underneath it. I went looking for the woman I thought was stealing my husband. I found a sister none of us knew we needed, a daughter's grief I never knew to look for, and a family that finally stopped protecting each other from the truth long enough to actually hold each other through it. 26 years of marriage taught me to read the silences in my house. It took this one, the hardest one, to teach me what to do when I finally understood them.